And we will be posting this recording of today's webinar to our website at deq.mt.gov, and we'll send out further details once we do post it. Wanted to let folks know that how we're going to structure today's webinar. We're going to do some brief introductions from management at DEQ and MDT, and then also walk through some key points of the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure NEVI formula program, as well as key points of the draft plan that we posted recently. And then we'll open it up to general questions about the plan, but also any public comments that folks would like to submit. And we'll make sure to be keeping notes for those, including this recording, to keep for our record to see what kind of changes we might need to make based off of those public comments. If throughout the webinar you have questions, we'll be, again, taking those questions and the public comment towards the end. Put them into the Q&A section feature of the Zoom webinar, and we'll make sure to answer those questions either verbally through the folks participating today from DEQ and MDT, or we'll post answers to the Q&A section as well. If you're participating by phone, it is *6 to unmute yourself and *9 to raise your hand. Also, once we open up the public comment, and I'll remind you again of this, once we get through our presentation, feel free to raise your hand and we'll call on folks and try and get as many participants called on as we possibly can. So at this point, I would like to introduce our first speaker to kick us off. Sonia Nowakowski is the administrator of the Air, Energy, and Mining Division at the Montana Department of Environmental Quality since the spring of 2021. She replaced our current director, Chris Dorrington, who was previously our AEM administrator. Sonia previously served as the Director of Legislative Services Office of Research and Policy Analysis, with a key focus on expertise in energy policy and development and analysis. I'd like to hand it off to Sonia.
Well, good afternoon, and thanks, Neil, for that introduction. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm happy to be here today, and I'm really pleased about all of the input that we've received from Montanans over the last few weeks on the state's electric vehicle infrastructure plan. Today is an opportunity for us to share a little bit about how your input has already informed Montana's plan and us moving forward. So as many of you know, these funds are part of the larger bipartisan infrastructure bill and are intended to help develop publicly available electric vehicle fast charging stations along interstates and U.S. highway corridors. And DEQ and MDU have partnered to plan how the state of Montana is going to use these funds. And so today's webinar is really the culmination of that partnership, which has been a really great experience for us. And this plan is going to inform future funding opportunities we hope to announce in the coming months. To that end, DEQ and MDT will continue to work to update the plan annually to include progress made, and then also to identify new priority locations for fast charging stations. So certainly not the end of the line here, lots of continued progress on this front. So we've developed a plan with the help of Montanans that will build a statewide reliable network of electric vehicle charging infrastructure. However, we still want to hear from you about additional information that we need to consider for Montana's plan. I'm excited again about these opportunities that are before us. Montana's developed a plan that puts us on a path to accelerated and equitable EV adoption in Montana, reduces transportation-related emissions, and positions the state to be a part of electrification efforts across the nation. So thank you for participating in today's webinar, and we look forward to working with all the successful applicants as we all drive, all puns intended, into this exciting future. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Rob Stapley, Administrator for the Rail Transit and Planning Division with MDT.
Thank you, Sonia. I appreciate that. Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of MDT and our partners at DEQ, I want to say thank you for your interest and for taking the time today to join us and learn a little more about Montana's EV deployment plan. Montana, as I think most know, was a lucky recipient of federal funding through the reauthorization of the Federal Transportation Bill, or IIJA as some like to call it, Over the next 5 years, Montana will receive approximately $43 million specifically for funding EV charging infrastructure along alternative fuel corridors. These are federal funds, which means, yes, there are strings attached in how we use them. MDT's role going forward will be to administer those funds in a way that will meet all federal requirements. DEQ will be developing a program to prioritize locations for these charging stations. We do not anticipate the charging stations being within the state or MDT's right-of-way, as federal statute prohibits the installation in interstate right-of-way. As I mentioned just a minute ago, the funding must be spent along designated alternative fuel corridors. In Montana, these corridors are I-15, I-94, I-90, US 2, and US 93. While Montana may be at a slower adoption rate of EVs compared to the rest of the nation, we may be seeing that change, given potential trends in the federal investment in EVs. So we anticipate there may be more EVs driving on Montana's roads here in the near future. Tourism plays a big role in Montana's economy, and we can anticipate that tourists coming to our state will be driving EVs in increasing numbers. This plan outlines how the state will prioritize EV charging infrastructure to support the national network. Again, thank you, and we welcome your feedback and your input on this plan as we move forward with this new program. At this time, I'd like to turn it back over to Neil and let him introduce himself.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks, Sonia. We appreciate those comments. We're just going to get right back into it again. Neil Ullman with the Energy Office in Montana DEQ. Want to give some brief background in case folks haven't been reading up about what this NEVI program is. The National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, NEVI, was created, as Rob said, as part of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or IIJA, that was passed by Congress late last year. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law included $7.5 billion in total for EV charging stations, and $5 billion of that was set aside through this NEVI formula program. The NEVI program requires a 80-20% cost share split, so the NEVI funds can pay for up to 80% of these projects, while there is a 20% non-federal match requirement. The purpose of the NEVI program is to create and support a convenient, affordable, reliable, and equitable national and statewide here in Montana EV charging network. The priority, again, for the Federal Highway Administration is along designated alternative fuel corridors, which Rob touched on, but we'll get into more detail in a few moments, with a focus on rural areas and underserved communities. Montana is estimated to receive an approximately $43 million over the course of the 5-year life of this infrastructure law. And for the first year, our allocation is estimated to be approximately $6.3 million. In future years, we'll receive approximately $8 million per year, but we'll learn more about that from the Federal Highway Administration as those allocations roll out. At this point, I want to hand it over to my colleague over at MDT, Ben Murphy.
Thanks, Neil. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ben Murphy, and I'm a transportation planner at the Montana Department of Transportation. Myself and a few other colleagues at MDT have been working with Neil and Kyla and the folks at DEQ to develop this deployment plan, so thank you all for taking the time to tune into this webinar today. I'm going to go over the schedule for this deployment plan. As you can see, the plan was released on June 27th, and it has been open for public comment, and that does close on July 18th, which is a week from today. We will take any final edits made from this public comment period and then submit a final plan to FHWA on August 1st. FHWA then approves the plan by the 30th. Once that plan is approved, we will be working quickly to develop a funding opportunity in early fall or late fall, early winter of 2022. Once we develop that, we will release this funding opportunity and hope to have awards out by early 2023, with construction following closely after. This is our map of the alternative fuel corridors that Rob had mentioned. As you can see, they are I-15, I-94, I-90, US 2, and US 93. Funding from this program must be spent along these routes. And once the designated corridors are built out, then we would be able to spend that money on routes that are not designated. We did not designate any new corridors for 2022. However, there is an annual request for nominations for new corridors, so we can nominate more new corridors down the road based on feedback that we receive. There are a lot of miles to be covered on this corridor, so this is where we're going to get started for this year. But we do acknowledge that there is a desire to place charging station on other routes around the state, and we are taking that into consideration. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Kyla to give a brief overview of the plan.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kyla Mackey. I'm an energy resource professional at the Energy Office at the Montana Department of Environmental Quality. Thanks for joining us today. I'm going to go over a little bit more overview of the draft plan that we have available for public comment. Just a little bit more background on some of the minimum requirements under the NEVI program. So for the electric vehicle stations themselves, they're required to provide at least 150 kilowatts of power to a single vehicle. They have to be publicly available. They have to have the CCS plugs, which are the universal plugs that are available to any type of make and model of vehicle to plug in. Each location has to have at least 4 direct current fast chargers that can charge 4 electric vehicles simultaneously. As we've mentioned, these locations, in order to use NEVI funding, have to be on a designated alternative fuel corridor. They have to be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They also have to be, in order to get the corridor designated as corridor ready, they have to be no further than 50 miles apart for each location. And then the locations have to be within 1 mile of the corridor and within a quarter mile of amenities, things like restrooms, a restaurant, retail shops, any amenity that folks might be able to use while their vehicle is charging. The vehicles have to achieve an operation of and reliability of at least 97% uptime, which some of the definitions of that are still being developed, but these stations need to be reliable so drivers can ensure they're going to get a charge when they plug in. And then they have to be operated and maintained in the same location for at least 5 years. So just a high level, again, this is high level and overview of our plan. And our plan is kind of a high level of strategy of how the state intends to spend the NEVI funds in this first year. So third parties, it's intended that third parties and not the state will own and operate the charging stations and provide the non-federal matching funds of 20%, at least 20%. The state anticipates issuing competitive solicitations for proposals to install, operate, and maintain the electric vehicle charging stations funded under this program. One of the primary goals is to provide public funds in underserved and rural areas. And our approach is really kind of a phased approach that you'll see in the plan, which is to fill the 100-mile gaps along the designated corridors, prioritizing interstates per the federal guidance first, and then addressing the 50-mile gaps in later years of the program. Also, a focus is going to be on locations that are hubs, which we've defined as the intersection of at least 2 major travel routes in the state, and then gateway communities, so communities that are near or close to national parks or other important recreation areas. We're going to continue to assess nominating additional corridors. I think this was mentioned, but on that annual basis as alternative fuel corridors for this NEVI funding locations and corridors that can be eligible for the funding over the 5 years. And then finally, we are also going to work closely with private entities to monitor their investments along corridors. So this would be Electrify America, Tesla, other companies that may have national networks, and we want to avoid duplicating locations along the corridors. A little bit of background on our public engagement to date. And so we started back in April. We had a kickoff webinar with some explanation of what the NEVI program is. We also announced a public survey at that point, which the survey closed on June 30th. We received over 400 responses from 47 out of Montana's 56 counties. So a good response rate on that public survey. That input, as well as direct stakeholder meetings and engagement with specific organizations and individuals, occurred between April and to date. And that informed our draft plan, as well as specific requests for information on some technical aspects of and design of our program from electric utility providers and charging equipment providers and manufacturers. So we also receive specific responses from those entities in responding to questions about technical aspects. Some existing and future conditions that are described in the plan that really helped inform our strategy is kind of this lay of the land. So Montana has about just under 2,000 electric vehicles that are registered in the state as of January of this year. The current public fast charging station locations in Montana, there are 9 of those. And they are located in Dell, Butte, Missoula, just outside of Missoula, Polson, Whitefish, Bozeman, Gardner, and the Seeley Lake Station, which isn't on this map. So the locations in orange are the fast charging stations. The Seeley Lake location just came online. So, and these locations, some of them are NEVI compliant, some of them are not. Funded through our Volkswagen dollars, and they are fast charging locations, but they may or may not be NEVI compliant. And then additionally, there are 9 planned public fast charging locations in the state, in Hamilton, Deer Lodge, Big Timber, Hardin, Billings, Dillon, Helena, Great Falls, and Conrad. And then finally, we also were considering what future conditions would potentially be like in this state for the number of electric vehicles driving. So had a study commissioned, and they determined that under a medium kind of electric vehicle adoption scenario, that about 130,000 electric vehicle drivers would be traveling in Montana by 2030. Most of these would be out-of-state drivers. So it is important to factor in out-of-state visitation and EV adoption. Just we're trying to facilitate that travel from neighboring states and that interregional travel that we experience in Montana that's important to our economy. We also factored in some equity and workforce considerations in our plan. That was an important piece that is required and important to develop these fast charging locations in an equitable way. And so from President Biden's Justice 40 initiative, which is that 40% of the benefits of the federal funding should flow to what's determined to be disadvantaged communities. For the U.S. Department of Transportation under this program, they've identified 21 in 21 counties in Montana, disadvantaged communities, and then all of the 7 Indian reservations in the state. There's a map. You can go to that link and see where the disadvantaged communities are located. They're also listed in the plan. The plan also describes our approach for engaging with those communities before placing fast charging stations in those locations. And then another consideration was that the electric vehicle infrastructure and opportunities for workforce development, and that these electric vehicle stations should be installed by highly skilled workforce and maintained. So installation and maintenance must also comply with Montana's permitting, state-specific permitting and licensing requirements for electricians and other associated workforce. And then finally, additional consideration is going to be given for projects where electricians are trained through specialized electric vehicle training programs, such as the EVITP or Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Training Program, which is a national program, but each state has certified trainers. And then finally, just wanted to note that there is a process for states to seek what's called discretionary exceptions from some of the minimum requirements of the NEVI program that I covered in the beginning. And at this point, for this iteration of the plan, Montana is not seeking any discretionary exceptions to these requirements. The state will continue to evaluate certain issues that may trigger the need for any exceptions or waivers. Considering the rural nature of the state, we will file an update to our plan annually. And the issues that we'll continue to monitor are the minimum number of charging stations that are required at each location, that 50-mile maximum distance between the stations, and the 1-mile distance from the interstate and highway exits, and certain circumstances where that would be challenging or cost prohibitive. So finally, just wanted to remind folks on how to submit comments and read the draft plan if you are interested. So you can read the draft plan at that link there. And then please submit any written comments. There's of course an opportunity to comment today. Verbally, you can submit written comments to mtenergy@mt.gov. And then again, written comments should be submitted by the end of the day next Monday, July 18th. And then we can take comments and questions at this point, and I'll turn it over to Ben Brower to facilitate the question and answer.
Thanks, Kyla. This is Ben Brower. I'm the supervisor of the energy planning section in the Energy Bureau at Montana Department of Environmental Quality. So as Kyla explained, there's a couple of ways that you can submit comments, either by writing or by email to the email address on our screen there, or today with a live comment, either in the chat box, in the Q&A box, or if you raise your hand, we'll get to you. So we're going to go in the order that we're seeing hands go up or questions coming into the Q&A. Chuck McGraw, we're going to start with you. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you so that you can provide your comment or question.
Thanks, Ben. I just wanted to kind of compliment the Energy Bureau and MDT for developing the plan, working on it, and moving this ball along. I think it's critical for Montana. I think it's critical for economic development in the state, and I really want to thank you guys for being proactive and getting on it. That's it.
Great. Thank you for the comment, Chuck. We're going to move next to a question in the Q&A box from Michael D. Shalis. Sorry if I butchered your last name there. The question is, or first a comment, EV charging is not like gas stations. A fill-up can take much longer, even while fast charging. Expanded access to shops and restaurants is more desirable than gas stations and can have a significant local business impact. How is the plan ensuring the infrastructure installer is working with locals to select locations in line with their growth policies and zoning preferences? Kyla, could you please go ahead and address the question in that comment and question?
Yeah, sorry, I was just trying to track that last part.
Do you see the question there in the Q&A box? Yep.
Yes. So this is one of the areas that we will that we intend to address in the RFP process, as well as reviewing the applications. And so whoever is installing the infrastructure or working with the third party that owns the infrastructure, we will want to see how they are working with the site host as well as the local community to make sure that they're following any local codes, ordinances, and other laws that are specific to that location. Hopefully that answered your question. More information to come during the RFP solicitation process.
Thank you, Kyla, and Michael, thank you for your comment as well. Let's see, next question is in the Q&A box from Amy Trad. Can an additional alternative fuel corridor be added to this draft? Neil, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Amy. So it was kind of an overlapping process, just the way that the information and the guidance rolled out from the Federal Highway Administration. And so the Federal Highway Administration accepted a round of new alternative fuel corridor designations earlier this year. It was actually the sixth round. We participated in rounds 3, 4, and 5, I think. And so that round closed on May 13th, I believe. But like Kyla said earlier, there will be annual designation nomination processes in order to add additional corridors. So if you look in the draft plan, you can see where we received significant public comment on a number of different highway corridors in Montana that folks thought that we should add or designate. One of the things that did come up recently on a webinar that the feds held at the Joint Office on Energy and Transportation presented on is that I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar that there was $7.5 billion for charging station infrastructure spending, and that $5 billion was designated for this formula program. The other $2.5 billion, we hope to learn more about this fall, hopefully in November. It's being referred to as the Community Grants Program. And on that previous webinar that was hosted last week, I believe, the Joint Office on Energy and Transportation said that, if there are communities along non-designated corridors, they should be looking at those community grants. And because those funds do not necessarily have to be spent along designated corridors. And so if there's the big hole that's constantly been pointed out to us, and rightly so, for example, is Lewistown, exact center of the state of Montana, not on a corridor right now. If someone in Lewistown wanted to get together with other businesses and community leaders and apply for those community grant funds directly to the FHWA, then they should look for more information on how to do that later this fall and early winter. But hopefully, as we update our plan each year throughout the 5-year life of this infrastructure bill, we'll be taking a closer look and asking for more public comment on additional corridors.
Thanks, Neil, and Amy, thanks for your question. We're going to go to a attendee who has their hand raised, Robert Spatz. Robert, I'm going to go ahead and allow you to unmute yourself and ask your question or provide your comment. Robert, go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon, thanks. I noticed you said early in the beginning of the program it was an 80-20 breakdown. What is covered through the program? We work in several different states, and some states are covering the software program, even though they required it. Some are not. Some are covering parts and labor warranty. Some are not. I was wondering what is going to be covered with this program.
Neil or Kyla, when you want to take that?
I can try to take a crack at that, do my best to answer specifically there. So we haven't determined the exact cost that will be covered. So the capital, the upfront costs, the actual equipment costs will be covered. And then, at least some of the operating costs, but we are still working through that, and that will be clear again in the RFP process, but it would be helpful for input on what costs should be covered, because the federal guidance provides flexibility there for states that even things like electricity costs could be factored into the operating costs. And so any input on what costs should be covered, keeping in mind that, you know, we have to spread $43 million across a very large geographic area and get the, you know, most for those dollars, and how to do that in a way that cost effectively funds these locations.
So I have one other quick question and I'll let you go, I promise. Do you have any idea approximately how many locations you think your funding will cover?
Neil, do you want to speak to that? Neil, I'm not sure your connection's working for you at the moment. Kyla, can you
I
speak
was
to
muted.
Okay, go ahead.
Bob, I think that answer, as you probably know, will include any number of different caveats. You know, one of the things that we're looking at is, and also the current rulemaking that's going on at the federal level is looking at the minimum number of stations. Also, depending on the community, the type of upgrades that may need to happen to local substations or transformers, and a whole host of other things, wiring, trenching, paving of concrete and parking spaces. We estimate, based off the information that we've received from charging station manufacturers and electrical utilities, that for a NEVI compliant, which means 4 150 kilowatt capacity chargers that can simultaneously charge 4 vehicles, that location would cost approximately just over $1 million. But that also doesn't take into account in certain rural places where there may already be 3-phase power, but there needs to be some additional upgrades, those costs could increase significantly. Also, given global supply chain issues and the cost of parts, chips, things of that nature, we're hoping that we can stretch this out, like Kyla said, as far as we can. So a guesstimate over the course of 5 years is, I don't know, 30 to 35-ish, maybe, possibly. Again, lots of caveats to go along with that.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for your questions, Bob. Thank you, Neil. Let's go next to a question in the chat box coming from Jennifer James. How do we get notified if wanting to bid on charging stations? Neil or Kyla, could you drop a link into the chat with the sign up for our notification list? If there's anything else you want to add on notifications, chime in now. So Jennifer and anyone else who's interested, please go ahead and sign up on our notification email list that we've been using for all notifications related to electric vehicle planning efforts that we've been playing a part in here at DEQ. Going back to the Q&A, we've got a question from Alex Massar. Can we clarify which agency or agencies would be responsible to achieving the 97% reliability goals for the charging stations? Kyla, do you want to speak to that reliability goal requirement?
Sorry about that. Yeah, so with the 97% uptime or reliability requirement, that's the minimum requirement from the federal government. The definition of what uptime means, I mean, it seems pretty straightforward that it would be that the charger is available to charge a vehicle, and that's generally what's going to be required. Whichever agency, you know, could be DEQ and working closely with MDT, but the agency issuing the RFPs and filing the reports on the funding for this program will be responsible for monitoring the uptime. As well as there are some third-party websites that, you know, PlugShare is the primary one that I'm aware of, where drivers can actually register sort of their uptime experience and whether charging stations are available. That may become more streamlined. So Again, to be determined on the uptime requirements, but and whatever formula and factors will go into determining what uptime is. Those are all to be worked out through the program, but it will be well-defined, and applicants will know how to report that and who to report that to.
Thank you, Kyla, and thanks for the question. Going to a caller, Thomas Coleman. Thomas, I'm going to go ahead and allow you to talk. You can unmute yourself and provide your comment or your question.
Sure thing. Thanks, Ben. Well, and thanks everyone for all the great work on the draft plan. It was fun to read through. I guess my comments were one related to Neil's follow-up question on, or his point about utility upgrades and the costs there, are if there's any guidance from NEVI on if 450 kilowatt stations they're required to be simultaneous, but do they all have to be continuous? E.g., could you have, there are battery buffered solutions available that might have a lower utility requirement that basically charge a local lithium-ion battery as part of the solution that then can output 150 kilowatts to a vehicle, and you'd only run into challenges if during very high usage rates where you have vehicles back to back. It seems like in some of these areas, it might help funds be stretched quite a bit further where you don't need massive utility upgrades. Because I do know there's some commercial solutions out there available right now. So anyway, that was my first question. I have one other after. I'll let you chew on that one for a minute.
You bet. Thanks for the question, Thomas. Kyla, could you speak to that question? Kyla, I believe you're muted.
Yes, I can. My sound kind of cut out actually at the end of that. So sorry.
Yeah, I can go. I can take it. The question, is whether the funding could be used for battery backup systems on site there, and that is potentially eligible. We certainly, considering that as a potentially eligible cost, although the final details of whether we'll fund battery backup systems will come in the form of the RFP, and certainly it's a consideration that we've considered in looking at sites that don't have significant on-site distribution system capacity to handle a lot of charging demand. Thomas, you had one other additional question? Yeah,
if there's time. The other point is, as EV pickups and SUVs are becoming much more available and common, it would be interesting to have guidance on trailer access. We're going to see more and more people with travel trailers and commercial trailers, and that's something right now, if you look at the existing commercial installations, that's generally not considered at all, where it'd be almost impossible to get a trailer into most of them. So it'd be kind of nice to see some guidance go out there.
Great. Thanks for that comment, Thomas. Neil, Kyla, our plan doesn't currently address that. Anything to add on that comment, though, or that question?
It's a point well taken, and Kyla and I both had kind of an aha moment earlier this year, especially when the Lightning started to get delivered in the Rivian R1T, that some of the fast charging locations that we funded through our Volkswagen settlement dollars are simply parking spots. But now that you have these things, I mean, even some of the small crossover SUVs that are being sold right now, like the Volkswagen ID4, can tow up to 2,700 pounds, which isn't a full-size camper, but it can tow something. So yeah, we're very cognizant of the need to be able to do pull-throughs. I would say that, at least in my mind, and again, we haven't developed the RFP yet, if you look at the fast charging locations that Electrify America is operating in Montana, at the Walmart in Missoula, the Flying J in Rocker, that those probably would kind of look like what we may be looking at here in Montana with the NEVI funds, where they're side by side. You can pull through on either side, depending on what side your charging port is on, and also depending on whether or not you're pulling something. So yeah, it's something we're very aware of, and we want to make sure that we're being cognizant of.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Thomas. Going now to the Q&A. Neil, a question related to an issue addressed earlier. Does Montana have a number of sites identified that they will need to put in to complete the network? Do you know how many per year and what price you're expecting per site?
I think I touched on this a little bit earlier, and then Kyle, if you want to jump in on the other study that we're working on, the cost per site for a 150 kilowatt capacity location, we guesstimate to be around $1 million-ish. And again, there's a lot that you need to take into consideration there. And it could be less, it could be a lot more. We're aware of some very small rural locations where just for the electrical upgrades in order to host a site that with that kind of capacity, those electrical upgrades alone would cost $300,000+ on top of everything else for the location itself. So you're probably looking closer to 1.5 million. So that's the rough back of the envelope guesstimate costs for a NEVI compliant location. Another strategy that we're looking at in order to, again, stretch our dollars as far as we can is that for areas of Montana, stretches of road where there's A, not much traffic, or B, not much EV traffic, is there a way that we can phase in that location for a smaller community where there's not a whole lot of EV traffic coming through? Do we really need to put in 4 150 kilowatt capacity chargers right now? Could we put in 2 and then come in later in the lifetime of the NEVI formula program over 5 years and reevaluate and evaluate putting in those additional, the second pair of fast chargers? So those are some strategies we're looking at in order to try and, because you look at, you know, the lengths of the corridors that we already have, it's well over 2,000 miles of road. And if you divide that by 50, that's a lot of charging locations. 50 miles, that is. So, Kyla, do you want to touch on the number of locations?
Sure, I can do that. Yeah, the number of locations, so identified through the alternative fuel corridors, current designated, the number of locations that we estimate is about 36 locations to meet that 50-mile requirement. And that's again on the 5 designated corridors. If we designate more corridors, of course, more locations would be needed. A full statewide network to accommodate the number of electric vehicles driving in the state in the future would be more than 36. But we'll get close with the funding we have for these currently designated corridors and take into consideration additional locations, future corridors.
Great, thank you, Neil, Kyla, and thank you for the question. We're going to go next to a question in the chat from Ian Lund. Kyla, will you be engaging with local government prior to or during the RFP solicitation process to notify them the funds are available and of options for their community? And maybe, Kyla, you could also speak to some of the outreach we conducted as part of the plan development with local governments as well.
Sure, yeah, so we do plan on direct engagement with local governments that are at priority locations or priority segments along the corridors. And during that RFP process, I think just a general comment that there will be public involvement in developing the RFP. This is a new program for the state, and so we do want to receive public input throughout, but also direct input from local governments. And we have met with several local governments already in communities, large and small communities that are along the corridors that helped inform the draft plan, notified them of this potential funding opportunities that are coming, and plan to stay in regular communication with local governments, chambers of commerce, community foundation organizations, and other organizations that are directly involved in these communities and who would have an interest. Nonprofit association, directly with nonprofits in individual communities. So the plan is to do additional outreach as we narrow in on some of these locations and nearby locations.
Thanks, Kyla, and Ian, thank you for the question. Going next to raised hand, Alex Eret. I'm going to go ahead and allow you to talk. You can unmute yourself and provide your comment or question. Alex?
Yeah, thank you, Ben. Hey, everyone. So my name is Alex Eret. I'm with ABB E-Mobility. We're the largest global manufacturer of EV charging stations. Just had a quick comment on for the plan. So in addition to requiring service and maintenance plans and allowing funding for them for operations and maintenance, we are also really advocating that Montana consider service level agreements with charging manufacturers. So really going beyond just, and typical service and maintenance, but ensuring that the manufacturer is included in that situation. And the reason for that is to ensure, so of course we offer a warranty on all of our products, but warranties just cover any sort of like defect, not necessarily a replacement of consumable parts like cables or connectors, which are subject to significant wear and tear. And then they also will allow for the highest possible uptime. So really making sure that we're compliant with that 97% and ensure preventative maintenance. And so also allowing us to prepare for and ensure that we have the materials and parts necessary to support all of the infrastructure that's out there. So we, of course, care deeply about reliability and want to ensure a really high quality experience for everybody in Montana. And in order to do that, we really want to advocate for SLAs to be required, service level agreements to be required with the manufacturer, not just the network provider as may be proposed.
Great, thank you for that comment, Alex. Just for our notes, can you please say again the business or organization you're with?
Yes, ABB E-Mobility.
Thank you. Great, we're going to go next to another question in the chat box. I can't see the full name from Yan. 2 questions here. Kyla, does the allocation of funding support utility strategies, i.e. home charging install rebates, peak versus non-peak utilizing discounts, assuming metering would be needed? Let's start with that one.
So the funding cannot be used at, say, a home charging location. It could envision a scenario where there would be a public charging location that could also serve, say, a multi-unit housing, multifamily housing locations, but the funding cannot be used for utility programs that would fund rebates for individual private residences. And then the funding being used for, you're asking about like a peak time incentive or rebates or incentivizing people to charge at certain times. If it's at a public location, potentially that would be a question we would have to explore and probably ask whether it's eligible for that federal funding, asking FHWA a question like that. But again, it needs to be at public locations only and available to the public.
Kyla, let's follow that up with Yan's second question. Has any study or EV usability study been referenced to understand the validity of the current one-year plan, focusing on major interstates versus vehicular tourism corridors, i.e. scenic byways, parks, and core destinations? In year 1, I'm skeptical on utilization due to a significant mix of traffic driven by commercial vehicles, which have low adoption. Kyla?
Yeah, so we did commission a study. AECOM did a study for us that is just about ready to release, and it's referenced in the plan. But that study did estimate sort of utilization scenarios along the corridors. I don't think there is low utilization that's anticipated. It does look at current traffic counts along the interstates as well as the highways. The federal guidance does encourage states to focus on the interstates. US 93 is actually the second highest traveled corridor in Montana. That is a designated corridor, but of course it's not an interstate. So that will also be on the priority list, but the year 1 investments are following the federal guidance to focus on locations along the interstates for interstate travel.
Thanks, Kyla. And Yan, thanks for your questions and your comment as well. Going back to the Q&A from an anonymous attendee, Neil, will each site be its own procurement, or is there an opportunity for multiple sites to be packaged together? Said otherwise, how many sites does the state intend to include in an RFP?
Well, you can see from the draft plan that for our initial round of priority locations, we have 10 total. And so we're still trying to figure out how the RFP will be structured, who amongst DEQ or MDT or both will be leading the procurement efforts, awards, project management for those projects once they're awarded. I think our hope is that we could try and do it within, somebody could potentially apply for multiple locations in a single proposal, but we also don't want to prohibit, local entities that are, in one of those 10 communities, for example, from applying to host the location in their own home community. So it's all kind of TBD at this point. I can tell you that through our previous RFA using our Volkswagen settlement dollars, we did a mix. We did 1 award for 9 locations, and we did 2 awards for 1 location each. So we may be looking at something similar for the NEVI funds, but TBD over the course of this summer and early fall.
Thanks, Neil. And I think we've also addressed the question that comes later in the Q&A. Will it be DEQ or MDT or both who release and evaluate the RFP responses? As Neil mentioned, that the administration of the program is still under development. So stay tuned on some of those additional details. Next question in the Q&A, Kyla, if you could take this one from Colin Kelly. The question in the draft plan, it is mentioned that one of the known challenges are current utility rate structures, especially in lower utilization areas. In what ways are you working with utilities and electric co-ops to address this concern?
Yeah, so we have worked with and engaged with co-ops and our investor-owned utilities up to now throughout this process, and the particularly the demand charge issue, of course, is one that's come up. It's one we noted in our plan. Of course, every utility has their own rate structures, and they're designed to recover costs. These costs can pose a challenge for electric vehicle driving, as you know, especially in the low utilization areas, as you also noted. In working with the utilities, it requires the applicant being aware of these issues, as well as potential ways to mitigate some of those demand charges. And moving forward, continue to work with the utilities is going to be important. And on the equipment side, there also may be ways to minimize some of those demand charges to reduce the demand on the system from the EV charger. So more to come again on that, but it is a particular challenge. And then I'll just note, which we've mentioned before, which is possibly putting in 2 chargers to begin with to accommodate the low utilization and address that, and then put in additional chargers in the future when electric vehicle adoption and utilization increases.
Thank you, Kyla and Colin. Again, thank you for your questions and your comment as well. Going to a question from an anonymous attendee: will there be a site visit to locations during evaluation for funding to make sure that the chargers are located according to the NEVI guidelines? Again, the details of the RFP are certainly very much still in development. Kyla, anything to add to that reply, though?
Yeah, we'll consider, especially with this program and the requirements, site visits to ensure that the stations are installed according to the guidelines, at least requiring photographs and other documentation that meets the requirements, and then, follow-up visits potentially may be involved and required through this program. So we're making sure that the funds are going to be spent in the way that they're intended to.
We have a comment from Scott Leap. Doesn't look like there's a question in there, but the comment is, when you talk about placing these in rural areas and underserved communities, to us, the key to sustainability is the owner being able to pay maintenance expense on these large charging stations. I like your notion of waivers to the NEVI requirements, smaller chargers in smaller communities. What costs, anything we can do to front load maintenance expenses, coverage for the location, make it easier for these rural communities to afford. Scott, thanks for your comment there. If you do have a question, please feel free to add that as well. Let's see. Going next one down in the Q&A from an anonymous attendee. Are you requiring trailer pull through stalls at every site? Neil, I think you addressed this earlier. Anything to add on your earlier response discussing trailer pull-throughs?
Nope.
Okay, thank you for the question. And let's see. Looks like we've got a hand raised from Justin Ackley. Justin, I'm going to go ahead and allow you to talk. Feel free to unmute yourself and provide your comment or question.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. Ben, Neil, Kayla, it's good to talk to you guys again. I just wanted a point of clarification on Neil, in your comment a little bit earlier regarding RFP selection. Nothing, the way we read the draft plan is it's still a kind of individual site selection, but what you were saying potentially was nothing prevents an individual applicant from putting multiple site selections into a single RFP. Is that what you guys are trying to determine right now? But overall, it's still individual competitive site selection. Is that right?
Neil, do you want to speak to that?
Well, Justin, again, I think that there's still a lot to be determined, including the scope and how the RFP ends up coming together. Again, speaking to our previous experience with Volkswagen Dollars, when we had a multiple location application submitted to us, that application identified the locations within a community that the applicant was applying for. They provided the address and whatnot, and the site drawings for where those fast charging stations would be installed. But along this, in the same community, in a couple of instances, we had other entities apply for just that community and not the other entities along the corridor. And so we consider both of those applications and put them next to each other. So I think ultimately we may be accepting applications for multiple communities across the state that are identified as priorities in this draft plan. But also if somebody just wanted to apply for one of the communities that's identified as a priority in this draft plan, we would also look at that proposal. But a lot to be determined on how the RFP is built and then ultimately published.
Okay, that's great. Thanks for that. And we look forward to being part of that conversation as well.
Thank you, Justin. We're at time here, and we've gotten through all of our questions in the Q&A and the chat box that I am seeing. But we'll go ahead and leave it open for another minute or two. If there's any additional questions or comments that folks would like to provide at this time, feel free to raise your hand or submit those via either the chat or the Q&A. As we mentioned earlier, we're certainly accepting written comments by email as well through July 18th. Kyla or Neil, did you see any questions or comments that I've missed? Okay,
Nope.
it looks like we've got one more that just jumped in there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Dan. Great. With that, I think we'll go ahead and close it up. As was mentioned in the chat, we will go ahead and post a copy of these slides to our alternative fuels website. Feel free to follow up with additional comments, and thank you all for your participation today and the excellent questions and comments. That's going to do it. Thank you all.